Today I have a roundup of 12 palettes that I think are perfect for spring, and this is by no means a comprehensive list because I can think of so many more palettes that would also work for spring, but I had to put some kind of limit on myself, otherwise I would be yapping here for over an hour. Also, hi, my name is Noopur and I love indie makeup and all things color and sparkle, and I would really appreciate it if you gave this video a like and consider subscribing. Both of these things support me, and if you like indie makeup content, this is the place to be. I would also love to know what your favorite palettes for spring are, so please comment down below if you have any, and I can't wait to see what they are. So I've only done one other palette roundup video, and that was my favorite palettes of 2024, which was of course suited to my preferences. I chose palettes that I personally was a fan of, but for today's video, I wanted to do something that had more of a variety and wasn't just suited to my own preferences, because I want there to be something for everyone in this roundup. I have a couple of disclaimers before I get started, and the first one is that these are in no particular order because you can never force a Libra to rank something if they don't want to. You just can't. The second disclaimer is that I did receive a lot of these palettes in PR, and I also have codes with a bunch of these brands, so I'll be sure to note that both on screen as well as in the description box. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into the fun part. So first up, I have a brand new palette that just launched at the beginning of this month, and that's Jay's Joy from Titanium Foxes Cosmetics. Here's the color story, and the brand owner mentioned that this is her take on offering some spicy neutral type of shades, and I like that in addition to that, we have some murky tones, which I feel like go really well with more neutral tones, but you also have a few pops of color, especially in the shimmers, and that just screams spring to me. This brand always does a really good job of offering depth options in their palette, so even though I feel like spring is typically a season where people do a lot of pastels and brighter tones and things like that, and there will be some palettes with those tones coming up, but I really enjoy that this is a more unique take on a spring palette, and I love the idea of murky tones for spring, especially this chartreusey type of shade over here. This is such a pretty color, and my first look that I did with this palette, I used this shade, and it was so pretty. I do want to point out that these three mattes look a little similar on camera and in a lot of the photos that I've seen, but when you swatch them out, they're quite different on the skin, and I really appreciate that. This one actually goes a lot darker on the skin than it does in the palette, and so I do consider it a decent deepening up option if you are close to my skin tone or lighter. But if you are darker, I do think that your main deepening up options are going to be this shade over here and this one up here. Two of my favorite shimmers and the standouts for me in this palette are this orange one over here and this blue one over here. The orange one is this gorgeous, vibrant, fiery, shifty shade. It's orange straight on and yellow at an angle, and I just feel like it mimics the warmth of the sun that we look forward to in spring, and it's just so pretty. And then the thing that I love about the blue shimmer is that it has somewhat of a mid-tone sheer grayish taupey base, which I much prefer that over true iridescence, at least for putting all over the lid, because I feel like that kind of base makes it melt a bit better into my skin tone and there's no white cast. I've only used this palette once so far, but I'm already looking forward to using it more this spring, and I've already dreamed up a couple more looks I want to do, so I'm really just itching to get my fingers back into it. Next up is another palette from Titanium Foxes, and this is Poppy Quiet, which was released last spring. This one I purchased myself because when I saw this color story, I fell in love, and this actually made it into my top 12 palettes of 2024 because I just love everything about this palette. Once again, this isn't a palette that has a lot of pastel tones. In fact, there are a few murkier shades here, but you also have some brighter pops of color like these two. But I feel like there's something about this palette that's kind of like muted pastels, if that makes sense, because I do consider a lot of these tones very spring tones, but they just have a touch of grunge to them. And then I think what specifically makes this such a spring palette for me, in addition to the tones of the mattes, is these three iridescents over here, because iridescents on their own without any mattes underneath are so bright and light, and they catch the light in such a beautiful way. But then you can also layer these over any of the mattes over here, and they bring so much life to a look. I also personally am a fan of doing a bit of a muted matte in the crease, or really with all the mattes. I love muted matte work along with more bright punchy shimmers. I think that's one of my favorite ways to add to have a look with contrast, and I think that's really easy to achieve with this palette. I feel like a lot of people go nuts over this shade Poppy Gem because it's got this very interesting purple to green shift, but I am a particular fan of this shade over here, this green shade Jewel Beetle, because it is such a pretty shade of green. I feel like with the iridescent, it's more of like that green that shifts to a blue and then an indigo, but with Jewel Beetle, it's got this it's like a grass-like quality. That's what it is. And I feel like I associate that with spring. I feel like Titanium Foxes usually likes to go pretty deep with their palettes. There are usually a lot of darker, smokier mattes, but this palette is the exception in their lineup because this brown shade is really the only deepening up option in the palette. But since it is the only deepening up option, I appreciate that it's a deep neutral brown because then it goes with pretty much any of these shades. Like I was saying that the only deepening up option in Poppy Quiet was a dark brown shade, but if you bring Jay's Joy into the picture, then you can use that grayish bluish shade at the bottom or the purpley burgundy shade at the top. And likewise, I wish that one of these browns was swapped for a much deeper brown, but if I pair it with Poppy Quiet, then I can bring in this deep brown shade. Next up is Fantasy Cosmetica's Cradled in Ice palette, which is not one of their D&D themed palettes, but just has a dragon theme, which really fits in with their whole fantasy vibe. Here's the color story, and the reason that I picked this one is that I am just a sucker for a pink-blue combo, and I think that because this palette has a lot of more pastel-y and lighter tones, it works really well for spring. But then in addition to the two pastel shades, you also have some mid-tones as well as this grungy shade, and then you have two deepening up options, one for each side of the palette. And I just think for a palette that is pretty much just a split color story between pink and blue, there's such a good amount of variety in here. Also, personally, I don't know about you, but whenever I see pink and blue together, I immediately think of Disney's Sleeping Beauty movie because I think of, you know, the two fairies when they're fighting over making Aurora's dress and they're turning it blue to pink to blue to pink, and then it ends up this like mishmash of blue and pink. That is what this palette makes me think of, and I actually did a little short form tutorial inspired by that. But then when I think about that movie, I think about specifically the animation. I think that the artwork in that movie is so spectacular and slept on, especially because I think people typically think of Sleeping Beauty as being a princess movie, and I know that Aurora is not one of the more popular princesses, but to me, Sleeping Beauty is really all about the artwork. It is just so stunning, such a spectacular movie in that regard. And when I think about that movie, I think about the forest and all the scenes in the forest and everything, and that's what reminds me of spring. So this palette to me is really a Sleeping Beauty palette, especially because at the end of Sleeping Beauty, the villain, Maleficent, she turns into a dragon, and this is a dragon-themed palette, so yeah, in my head, this is just a Sleeping Beauty themed palette. I also want to talk about the shimmers in this palette because they are some of the best shimmers that Fantasy Cosmetica has ever done. When I first got this palette, I was blown away, specifically by this shade and this shade. Both of them have multicolored sparkles and are so sparkly looking on the eye, but they're also incredibly wet looking. And I feel like a lot of shades that have multicolored sparkles aren't always wet looking at the same time, but these are just bonkers on the lids. I do want to note that just looking at the palette from afar, these shimmers kind of all look similar, but I think once you swatch them out, you see that they have slight nuanced differences. And yes, they aren't all that different because they have to fit into this blue-pink theme, but for being limited in colors that way, I think each of them are special and unique in their own way. Next up, I have the first palette that Fantasy Cosmetica ever launched, the Druid palette. Now I know what you're thinking. How is this a spring palette? It's so dark, it's so grungy, but to me, spring is green. That's why I popped up a green background back here and why I'm wearing a green eyeshadow look. I just feel like green is, spring is the season of growth, and there's so much green once spring rolls around. I just feel like this palette to me is spring. I also wanted to include an option that was a bit grungier and deeper for people who prefer those tones year-round, because just because spring has a lot of pastels and brighter tones doesn't mean you have to wear that. In fact, you could wear any of these palettes at any point of the year, and I do too. I just wanted to choose a roundup that made me feel like spring, and this palette does make me feel like spring. I don't know if make me feels like spring makes any sense, but we're just gonna go with it. The other reason that this reminds me of spring, much like the Cradled in Ice palette, is that this is inspired by Druids who wield nature magic. And like in The Witcher, you know, you have the forest druids, and to me the forest is in my mind, the forest is associated with spring. A couple of the standout shimmers to me in this palette are this green sparkly shade over here and this shade down here as well. And the green sparkly shimmer it's self-explanatory. It's got a beautiful sheer brown base with sparkles that shift from green to pink. And I've mentioned before that I love shades like this that aren't true iridescence and instead have a sheer taupey or brown base, because I love putting those all over my lid for like a wash of sparkle and not having to worry about any white cast. But also this shade down here, I feel like a lot of people weren't super happy with the shade because it's more satin-like and not super sparkly. But what I love about it is how rusty the base is, and there is some sparkle in it. So the way that I like to use this shade is as a base shade, and then I layer a more sheer sparkly topper shade on top, and it's just the most magical effect. I also just have to shout out the cover art because, I mean, look at it. It's so beautiful. I love the stained art type of artwork that they've been incorporating in their more recent palettes, and you can't tell me that this isn't spring embodied. I will say that this shimmer over here is not my favorite because it's more of a standard shimmer just like this one, but I really love the tone of this one. It's such a gorgeous lime green. This one is more of a neutrally gold, and it's not my jam. But the great thing about Fantasy Cosmetica's palettes is that they're all magnetic, so I can just take this out and swap it for something that I actually would use and curate my perfect spring Druid palette. Next up is Dieverune Cosmetics Gloomy Gardens, which also made it into my top 10 palettes of 2024. Here's the color story, and to me, this is a rainy, gloomy day, of course, in a blooming spring garden. You have your gray tones that are perfect for all of your rainy spring days, because without the rain, how would we ever have those pretty, pretty flowers? And then you have all of these gorgeous tones that mimic kind of a garden in bloom, but a lot of these tones have a touch of murkiness to them, which I think adds to that gloomy vibe. Like this green, even this purple shade, they just have a touch of grunge. I mean, obviously this one too, but then you also have some like truly, truly bright pops, like these peachy tones over here and this blue. And this palette doesn't go super, super dark. Your only two deepening up options are these two up here, but I think for a spring palette, that works out just fine. Also, if I'm not mistaken, I believe this palette is being restocked one final time and then discontinued. And I'm not saying that to be like, go buy this palette, because don't buy something unless you actually want to. I'm more so saying it because I don't actually know if any of these palettes that I'm talking about today have been discontinued and are no longer unavailable, but I still wanted to mention them because I want this video to be more of a go back into your collection and find those gems that you really love and pull them back out for spring. Like, yes, I am talking about a couple of newer launches, but a lot of these palettes are older. Like the Druid palette, that's one of the oldest palettes that I'm talking about today, but it's still so beautiful. Anyway, tangent aside, let's get back to this palette. And I do want to talk about the shimmers at the bottom here because I think those also make this such a pretty spring palette. Much like the Druid palette, you have this gorgeous vibrant lime green shimmer. To me, this screams spring, but also this shimmer over here is such a unique shade. It's got this gorgeous green muted base with a shift over it that kind of goes from like a purpley pink to a soft yellow, and I just feel like I don't see too many shades with this exact colorway, and it's just so special. It's not the most sparkly shade in the palette, but I think the tone of it totally makes up for that. Also, I got so excited about this shade that I forgot to mention that this is not just a standard shimmer. It is actually a shifty shade. It's not as overt of a shift as some of the other shades in this palette, or just shifty shades in general, but it does have a shift to it. And it's super sparkly and reflective. Next up is a Blend Bunny palette, and this is the Divination palette that's in collab with Robert Welsh. Also, I just want to take a minute for the cover because look at this. It's so cool. Here's the color story, and I think I may have already mentioned that I am not the biggest fan of pastels, and I feel like spring is all about the pastels, but as someone who kind of struggles with pastels, at least on their own, I tend to gravitate towards color stories like this that do offer some pastels, but they are alongside some more murky tones as well as deepening up options, because that's how I personally like to incorporate pastels as part of my look not necessarily the main focus. But don't worry, like I said, I'm not choosing palettes that are just for me. There are some more pastel palettes coming up. And this palette too does have pastel shades. This entire row is, well, not the bottom, but like a lot of the row is very pastel-y, and you could create a look with just those shades and some of these lighter shimmers over here, and it would be a gorgeous pastel spring look. Blend Bunny actually has one of the best pastel formulas that I've tried, and I don't even own their fully pastel palette, Sickly Sweet. I'm actually waiting to get that palette. I know it's crazy, me getting a pastel palette, but for the ways that I do enjoy incorporating pastels, I want them to be really, really high quality pastels. A lot of pastels, at least on me, are very difficult to build up. I really have to pack them on and just lightly blend the edges, but I don't find that to be the case with Blend Bunny's pastels. With Blend Bunny, I feel like they go on really true to pan, and I can build them in the way that I like to apply my eyeshadow, and it works perfectly fine. And that's why I am really interested in purchasing the Sickly Sweet palette, because when I do want to reach for pastels, I want them to go on fuss-free. And this palette is no exception. These pastels look so good. I actually did a look using pretty much, well, I did use a few deepening up options, but it was mostly a light pastel look. I really tried to push myself out of my comfort zone, and they went on so well. I did not use a light, brightening white base, and they still showed up really, really well and were pretty effortless to build. The shimmer formula in this palette is no joke either. It's that new improved Blend Bunny shimmer formula that's really quite sparkly and lovely, but still smooth, so you're not going to get any texture on your lids. And this shade Oracle is the most gorgeous multichrome. It's super shifty and beautiful. This iridescent over here, it's the shade number 7, is really such a unique tone. I feel like I don't have anything exactly like it in my collection. And this neutral shimmer down here is also super, super sparkly and beautiful. I love this for just a simple out the door neutral look. I do think if you have Sickly Sweet, that's probably the more spring appropriate palette, but for me, with what I have right now, I think this is the one for me. And speaking of all pastel palettes, my next choice is Pastel Garden from Bella Beaute Bar, and I'm sorry about the reflection. This palette is just, it has such a metallic cover that unless I tilt it downwards, you're gonna see some of that reflection. Here's the color story, and this is an extremely pastel palette, like very, very light and very pastel. There is absolutely no depth in this palette. It's all very light and very pastel, and if that's your jam, then you are going to love this palette. For me, I actually don't reach for this palette a lot for a couple reasons, but of course I wanted to include palettes for a variety of preferences, and this just doesn't really fit my preferences because, like I said, when I wear pastels, I want to pair them with a few deepening shades in some way or the other. Like one of my go-to methods to use pastels is to keep the lid super light and bright and then just do a dark smudged out liner along my lash line. But I would have to pair this palette with something else to do that. And I could very much do that. I could still, use this in the springtime and use another palette for depth. But I feel like the pastels in this palette work a lot better on lighter skin tones, because on me, first of all, some of the shades look very similar on me. I'll pop up some swatches that I did of this palette, and you can see that with a lot of the blues especially and stuff, actually with a lot of the shades, there isn't a lot of variety, and I think that if you have a lighter skin tone, those nuances and the colors will pop more. Also, just personally on me, this is the type of pastel formula that works a lot better if I use it over a lighter, brighter white base, which is not really my preference. I'll do it from time to time, but it's an extra step, and I would just prefer it if the pastels built well on my regular eye primer, which is usually the Milani eye primer. And with these pastels, I just feel like they're a bit more finicky. I have to work with them a bit more. But I don't think that they're necessarily a bad formula, because I know a lot of people really, really like this palette. It's not made for my preferences because I like to build and blend, and this is more of a pack and blend the edges type of formula, which is not the norm for Bella Beaute Bar. I feel like typically their shadows lend themselves really well to my method of building and blending. It's just this palette specifically with the pastels that I find is a little different. One thing that did surprise me about this palette is that the shimmers in this palette are really quite lovely. A lot of them have multicolored sparkles in them, and I was really surprised to see that. For some reason, I thought, before I received this palette, I thought that a lot of them were just kind of regular standard shimmers or just regular shifty shades and more pastel-y, but I was really, really pleasantly surprised by the shimmers. I do want to note that it looks like I have hard pan in some of these mattes, but they still pick up just fine both with the finger and a brush. I did test it before this video. So who is this palette for? Because I feel like maybe I sounded a little overly critical and harsh of this palette, and that's because I don't really love pastels on their own, you know, but like, I think if you are someone who enjoys pastels and more so enjoys nuances between tones and will look at, you know, these two greens or these two blues and be like, ah, yes, those two are totally different, then I think this palette is for you, because I will look at other tones that are non-pastels and think the same thing. I'll look at two purple shades that are just a hair different and be like, I need both of those. So if you are that person, then this palette is for you. Next up, we have another palette from Bella Beaute Bar, and this is Secret Garden, which came out spring of last year. This color story is so beautiful, and I know that I'm definitely biased because I love pink and green together. I mean, aside from my Wicked obsession, I just think pink and green truly go so good together. I just noticed that there is a matte missing from this palette. That's not a black shadow. That's supposed to be a pastel pink, but I don't know where it is. Let's pretend that there is a pastel pink matte here, and just for your reference, I'll pop up a photo of my flat lay that I took when this palette first came out so you know what shade it is. So like I said, I love pink and green together, but I particularly think that the shades in here are so perfect for spring. I think that, like, green to me is spring, like I said, but I think the florals that come out in spring, the pinks are perfect for that. And like I've said of previous palettes, within the tones of green over here, you have such a good variety and range. You have everything from light to deep, and then you have warm and cool. You even have this really interesting shade down here that's kind of like a neutral green. It has a lot of brown in it. It's like olivey, but it's very wearable. There are less pinks in this palette, and I think in terms of variety, I could have used maybe one more deeper pink shade. Like I could have swapped out one of these greens for a really like deep pink, because I feel like this is the deepest pink shade in the palette, and that's not enough for me to add depth. That being said, I do think that this brown pairs really well with the pinks, and so when I've done a pink look with this palette, I usually pull in that brown to add a bit more depth. But I know not everyone is as obsessed with getting depth in their looks as I am, so I do think that, you know, the majority of this palette leans more brighter and lighter, so I think it is really perfect for spring, where I think a lot of people are doing these more colorful, breath of fresh air looks. There's also a row of neutrals at the top over here, and as far as the tones go, I think that they're really pretty tones. I like that they don't lean super warm and rusty, but they're also not cool toned, and I think that that works pretty well for spring, because to me, in my head at least, I know not everyone thinks like this, but to me, warmer neutrals are for summer and cooler neutrals are for winter. And of course, I do wear both in both seasons, but when I think of the season just on its own, objectively, that's what pops into my head. And these are more on the neutral side of neutral, if that makes sense. And so I think they're really great for spring, which is kind of in between winter and spring and summer. I always say that Bella Beaute Bar is one of those brands that has both a good matte formula and also a great shimmer formula, and this palette is no exception. Three of my favorite shimmers in this palette are this neutral shimmer up here, this pink shimmer over here, and this gorgeous minty green shade down here. So Gazebo is a neutral, like champagne color almost, with a ton of holographic sparkles in there, and I know that in 2024 we saw a lot of holochromes, so multi-chromes or shifty shades with holographic sparkles, but I feel like we didn't see a ton of just like regular sparkly shimmers with holographic sparkles, and I feel like Bella Beaute Bar has been one of the brands that has been consistently putting shades like that in their palettes, and I really love that, because holo sparkles are so special on their own. I don't necessarily also need a shift in the shadow. Like sometimes I just want a really pretty sparkly shade with holographic sparkles in it. And then this pink shade Serenity is so pretty. I will say this was a pretty like squishy shade. It had a ton of emollients in it, and you can, I don't know if you can tell in the pan here, but I did have to like push a tissue paper onto there and get some of that out. So if you are prone to creasing, I don't know if this shade would be the best for you, but I think it's so special. I think a lot of pink shades default to shifting to yellow or gold, which is pretty overdone, but this one shifts to a green. So not only does it tie in with the rest of this palette, but it just looks so cool in the eyes because the shift is so pronounced, and green is such a different color from pink that you definitely notice that shift. It's also one of those shades that somehow walks the line between being a truly colorful shade and, I don't want to say neutral, but more wearable, you know what I mean? Then we have this gorgeous minty green shimmer down here, which is green in the sparkle straight on, but it shifts to kind of like a blue, which I think is really smart because then it adds some color contrast within an otherwise pink and green palette. I really love this palette, and it was one of my top spring palettes from last year, and it almost made it into my top 10 palettes of 2024, but I had to cut it because there were just other palettes that I wanted to include instead. Next up is my third and last choice from Bella Beaute Bar, which is Basic Witch, which was actually released in fall of 2023, I think. Here's the color story, and I actually have the original release of this palette, which came with just glued in pans, but in the more recent restocks of this palette, it's now magnetic, so the pans are removable. So this palette actually came out in fall of 2023, which technically makes it a fall palette, but I actually think it works really well for spring. And the reason I think it works well for spring is it has a couple of these, lighter pastel options, but kind of similar to Secret Garden, you have this like pink and green pairing, but also purple and green. And purple and green is another pairing that makes me think of spring. Actually, pretty much any pastel-y, lighter, brighter shade with green will make me think of spring. But I just think that all of the colorful mattes in this palette they remind me of flowers. And I know, flowers for spring, groundbreaking, but it's true. I don't know. I think the tones of this palette work really well for spring, even if this is technically a fall release. And something that I love about Bella Beaute Bar is they always nail color stories, like I said with Secret Garden. And this palette, I love that even though it's such a purple heavy palette, all of the shades of purple are so distinct and unique. You have a pastel, you have a mid-tone, then you're getting deeper. And even this shade, it's got a lot of gray in it, but it's still a purple. This shade is actually, I think it looks black on camera to you, but it's not. It's a very deep eggplant, and I love the range of purple in this. Something else that I love about Bella Beaute Bar, and this is definitely specific to me, but so many of their palettes don't have that like one, beigey matte neutral shade or a black matte, which I personally just don't have use for. I know a lot of people do, and so when I critique it, it's more so from a personal preference standpoint, but that is something I really appreciate about their palettes. And the shimmers in this palette are so beautiful. I love pretty much all of them. I think they're all so stunning, but I specifically want to call out this shade over here and this shade. First of all, they're both green, and I think by default that makes them both perfect for spring. I feel like such a broken record, but it's true. Green means spring. But specifically, I was actually recently talking to a friend about this shimmer over here, and it is such a unique shade. I don't have anything quite like it. I was looking for dupes, and I really didn't find anything in my collection that's exactly like it. I do want to note that this shimmer and this shimmer are technically holochromes. They have hollow particles in there, but since the release of this palette, I feel like Bella Beaute Bar has come out with better holographic shades that have hollow particles that are more visible in all lighting sources. And I feel like with these two shades, you really need to be in strong direct light to see the holographic particles, but they're still really beautiful and special. Like, I think these are gorgeous shifty shades in their own right. And then this shimmer over here is so beautiful. It's got kind of a gray base, which if you know me, you know I love that. I think that that really amplifies any shimmer that you put on top of it. It somehow boosts it and it makes it look so glowy. And so this shade is just, it's so luminous but also sparkly, and I think it just adds such a nice contrast to some of these other shades in here. Next up, we have another new release, and this is the Lovers Palette by Cosmic Brushes. I adore this color story. I think it is so beautiful. It was released as a Valentine's Day palette, but I think it makes a beautiful spring color story. What I love about this palette is that it goes both more neutral wearable and also colorful, and you have like a lot of pastel mattes, but then you also have some midtones and deepening up options. So I think it really is kind of there's something for everybody in this palette. I actually have a video going through this palette in depth, so I won't talk about it too much because you can just refer to that video for my full thoughts on this palette and to see all the shimmers and everything. But what I will say is this was my first experience with cosmic brushes after trying the Muse palette, and the shimmers in this palette are so lovely. They are so improved from Muse, and I was just really blown away by the quality of this palette. And considering the price point and just like the quality of the mattes as well, I think that this is such a good release from Cosmic Brushes, and I will definitely be reaching for it a lot in the spring. Next up, I have a licensed collab from Lethal Cosmetics, and this is from their Avatar collection. This is the Earth palette. This is a cute little 9-pan based on the Earth Kingdom from the Avatar show, and if you're not familiar with that show, there are 4 nations. Each one is based on a different element, so Earth, air, fire, and water. And so Lethal Cosmetics actually released 4 9-pan palettes. Each one was its own curated little color story, and this one was green for the Earth Kingdom, which aside from, I mean, I'm biased because I love the show, I love the property that this is based on, but aside from that, I think that this is actually such a solid green palette. I feel like there's a good range of tones with the mattes, and I will say that the one drawback with this palette is that these 2 mattes are pretty similar, at least on my skin tone, so I feel like it could have benefited with one of these being a bit more different, but I love that they included this tone in here. This is such a unique color. I feel like I don't really have a ton of mattes, if any, that are this exact shade, and it's just so special. I find myself reaching for this palette just for this matte quite a bit, and I love that the palette goes super deep. I also like that there are some brown tones in this palette because browns go so well with green for like an earthy vibe, of course, but I also think specifically for spring that makes so much sense. So the matte formula from Lethal is wonderful. I've tried their single shadows before, and I think this is maybe my only palette that I have from them, if I'm not mistaken. And the matte formula here is really wonderful, just like the singles that I've tried. And the shimmers are so pretty too. So I had previously tried some of Lethal Cosmetics single shadows way back in the day, like when I was first getting into indie makeup, and those shimmers were not the best. They were not the most sparkly, and that really comes down to preference. When I say that they're not the best, I mean that they're not the best for me. If you prefer a more smooth, less overtly glittery formula, then maybe you would like those shimmers. But I am someone who likes a lot of sparkle typically, and I love that in their recent releases, it really looks like they've been making some gorgeous sparkly shimmers. This multi-chrome in the center is so pretty. It's got such a strong shift, and it's very sparkly. It does have a little bit of texture to it, but I find that it applies really well on the lid. Then I also really love this chocolatey shimmer down here. I feel like one of my favorite looks that I've done with this palette is just throwing a neutral matte in the crease. Not this one, because this one is a little too dark, but a lighter neutral matte in the crease. Then I'll put this shimmer all over the lid and then use this to deepen up with, and it's so pretty. When I purchased this palette, it took me so much restraint to not purchase the entire collection, but I just couldn't justify it with how much eyeshadow I have, and I limited myself to only buying one of the palettes, and this was the one that spoke to me the most, and I just think it's perfect for spring. My last choice, and I should really say last choice with air quotes because I have a secret 13th choice that's an honorable mention that I will talk about after this, but my last choice is Vintage Neutrals from Arttitude Cosmetics. This is a color story that does have a couple of pastel-y options, but if you are someone who likes to go punchier in the spring after coming out of kind of like a gloomy, murky, grungy winter, this is the palette for you. So this is called Vintage Neutrals, but it is actually quite a colorful palette, and I do know that the owner was talking about how there are some neutral shades in this palette. Like you have this, beigey shade over here, and then some more like borderline neutral shades. You have this shade, you have this shade that comes off more like a rusty brown, and even this mustard I consider kind of a neutral. But then you also have those greens that I love for spring, and I just feel like the tones in here are so pretty. You have a pastel-y shade, and then you have this like very true when you think of the color green, this is what you think of. But then you also have this green over here that has quite a bit of blue in it. It's almost a teal. I wouldn't say it's necessarily like a true teal, but it does have a lot of blue in it. But then you also have these gorgeous peachy pops, you know, this one over here, this bright orange over here, and like this reddish shade to combine with them. I just think that these colors go so well together, and they evoke spring for me. It also helps that there are flower imprints on the pan, and my palette is a little messed up, but they're still there. Arttitude is kind of known for doing their 16 pan palettes that are usually more matte heavy and have less shimmers. So this palette only has 5 shimmers, but that doesn't make it any less special. Despite being a sparkle goblin, I have really come to appreciate matte heavy palettes because I feel like I personally am someone who reaches for palettes day to day for my mattes, but I'm happy to pull in a few special single shadows from brands that do more single shadows. So I'm really happy when indie makeup brands do matte heavy palettes. But let's talk about the shimmers. You have 3 shifty shades, this one, and this one. And the iridescent, it's beautiful. It's a standard, you know, pink to gold and even chartreuse type of iridescent. But the other 2 shimmers that I pointed out, those are such beautiful, vibrant shades that I really associate with spring and even summer. I feel like this palette would be a great transitional palette for spring into summer, especially these really, really bright matte tones. There are a couple of neutral shimmers in this palette too. This one is just kind of a light gold, an icy gold almost. And then there's this really chocolatey, deep, dark shimmer over here, which it's a bit of a disconnect for me in this palette because I feel like there aren't really a lot of mattes to pair it with aside from this one. But in terms of like a lighter transitional crease shade, I don't really see one in this palette that I would pair it with. So I don't quite understand why this is in the palette, but I also don't mind pulling in another palette for just a separate matte to pair with it. So that wraps up my main 12 choices, but I did mention that I have a secret 13th honorable mention, and it's what I have on my eyes today. And that is the Peach Perfect palette from Gourmande Girls. And the reason that this is an honorable mention is because when I did my makeup today with this palette, it was my first time using it. Gourmande Girls is a new to me brand, and the owner was kind enough to send me 4 palettes to test out and try. And so I actually did this look as a pre-filmed look for a bigger video that I'm doing next week that's going to feature all 4 palettes, so I won't talk too much about the formula and all that in this video, but I do really quickly want to show the color story because I do think this is so pretty for spring. I just can't really speak to the palette as a whole because I'm not really done testing it, and so I just wanted to really quickly show it and tell you that that's what I used to get my look today. Now that properly concludes this video. I'm done talking about palettes, thank goodness, because I don't know about you, but whenever I do any of these videos, I do a lot of takes, honestly, because like I mess up my words all the time and stuff like that, and I just feel like there's so much strain on my voice. I'm really glad to be done yapping. But let me know in the comments what your favorite palettes for spring are, or if any of the ones that I mentioned today are in your collection, whether you like to pull them out for the spring, or whether they're on your wish list, or whether you have other palettes on your wish list that you want to get for spring. I want to hear it all. Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching till the end. It's one of the best ways to support my channel, and I really appreciate it. And please don't forget to give this video a like as well before you leave, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!